Welcome back, boils and ghouls. When I originally set out to do this video, it was just going to be a controversy corner episode. The more I learned, though, the more intrigued I got. A few months ago in the comments section, someone brought up Erik Larsen, Mario Gully, and the incident. I was familiar, but I did some digging and quickly uncovered a much more interesting story than I initially recalled. Gully, otherwise known as the original Mario Gully, or just OMG for short, was a rising star in the comics industry, at least for a brief time. He quickly jumped from Arcana Studios to Image Comics, bringing his original creation Ant with him, and he even did some work with Roy Thomas and Marvel Comics. It seemed things were going Gully's way, and the stage was set for the rising star to come into his own. Behind the scenes, however, Gully's personal life was beginning to bleed more and more into his career and would eventually cost the creator everything. His reputation, his self-published original creation, his contract with Erik Larsen, his contract with Image Marvel, and then following a smattering of hope, his career as a comic artist altogether. The story of Mario Gully could be a heartbreaking and completely depressing one. The further I dug, though, the more inspirational I found it to be. Even the origins of the Ant character are some of the most intriguing and interesting origins of any comic book creation in history, and I'm not even talking about the comic. Gully was a man who made himself from nothing. Following years of rejection and a growing suspicion he would never make it in the industry playing by other people's rules, Gully decided to take the plunge and had planned on self-publishing Ant before he was approached by not one, but eventually 3 publishers before losing it all to a few stupid decisions that just happened to land on the front page of a lot of media outlets. From his meteoric rise to his almost silent dethroning, Mario Gully is a man who never ceases to surprise. So buckle up for a story of crime and betrayal and a little video essay I like to call The Ant-Man, Mario Gully, Erik Larsen, and the Ant Incident. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make a donation via Ko-Fi, pick up a shirt, or use the join button to sign up for memberships here on YouTube. But now, let's get into it. In 1996, at the time our tale begins, things were looking more than a little bleak for Mario Gully. He was actually incarcerated in a Florida jail for assault. While Gully has stated in interviews he thought that the man was a, quote, tourist, he apparently repeatedly tased an elderly gentleman and was subsequently sentenced to 5 months in jail as a result. While locked up, it seems that Gully, who came from something of a difficult background, truly sought to better himself, not only as a person either, but his mind and his skills as well. Rather than just kill time, Mario Gully set about bettering himself in any way that he could imagine. While there are a lot of people who do the same thing, Gully's particular inspiration came from a very strange and unlikely place: an ant crawling on the ledge of his cell window. In some early interviews, Gully talks about feeling ashamed about what he'd done and wanting to disappear being the reason he was so fascinated by the ant. In others, though, he simply talks about wanting to be free, wishing he could escape through the bars of his cell window as well. While I think most likely both of these things are true, it really does seem like Gully meant what he was saying about wanting to turn his life around. While in jail, you don't have an inordinate amount of access to many tools to practice trades or crafts, but you can get stuff to draw and paint with. Rediscovering his childhood love of drawing, Gully threw himself into the hobby once again, this time not only with a renewed interest and vigor, but all the time in the world to spend on it. It just so happened Gully was good at it. Really good, actually. I think it's likely Gully had always been a fairly gifted artist, and while his time inside might have given him time and focus to work on his craft like few other people ever dedicate themselves to, it's very likely he'd been gifted from a young age. It's just no one had either noticed or cared before. The youngest of 6 children, Gully grew up in a fairly poor family, and while he wasn't afforded many luxuries, he said in numerous interviews that his parents always tried to make sure he had what he needed, and when he got into comics, they always managed to find a way to get him some new ones periodically to read. As he got older and his love of comics grew, like a lot of kids, so did Gully's fascination with drawing. Unlike other kids, though, Gully wasn't really interested in copying his favorite artist's version of Spider-Man or Batman, or even doing his own versions. He was much more interested in creating his own characters and stories, even from this young age. So when Gully went to jail, he began to take his art much more seriously, and not only rediscovered a childhood love, but also a way to focus and better himself during his time behind bars. And it all started with a single tiny little ant on his windowsill. Gully, bored and behind bars, saw the ant crawling, weaving freely in and out of the bars of his cell. Staring at the insect, able to come and go as it pleased, he was instantly struck with inspiration and began to draw. Slowly but surely, he began to define and refine a superhero, or superheroine to be exact. In his many sketches and drawings, Gully drew anywhere and everywhere he could, and it wasn't long before the other inmates took notice. Before long, Gully, having a special knack for, shall we say, rather extensively endowed females, began drawing illustrations on letters and doing other commissions for inmates to pad out his commissary fund. While drawing these innumerable pinups of the female form, the figure of Ant began to take a more and more concrete form, and Gully found himself falling back in love with comics all over again. The letter illustrations and other commissions, his childhood love of comics, and the inspiration he had drawn from that fantastically free ant finally began to come together in his mind as he stared at a picture of the as of yet unnamed ant one day. Without provocation or anyone to tell him how insane of an idea it was, Gully set to work on what would eventually become a fully finished 24-page ant comic book prototype. If this is true, it's a rather incredible achievement. Within months, Gully had gone from a somewhat wayward youth locked up for assaulting an elderly man to concentrating his efforts on creating a fully finished and completed comic. While Gully has said that essentially everything about this original 24-page comic is completely different other than the costume, it definitely helped him refine the idea, figure out what worked and what didn't, and from there get a lot more serious about stuff. Interestingly as well, Gully has stated in interviews that he still has the original 24-page version of his comic, and I hope we see it pop up in a collection or something someday. While Gully knew the self-produced issue of Ant wasn't good enough to get him published, the time spent concentrating on drawing and the experience that he gained working on this as of yet unpublished Ant prototype proved to Gully he not only had what it took talent-wise, but that he could get the job done and was ready to get really serious about his art. And Gully almost immediately began submitting portfolios and samples for professional publication. Once he was released from the Florida County Jail, Gully set out determined to make his dream of working in the comics field a reality with or without anyone else's help. Gully didn't want to turn back to a life of crime, but by this time, now late 96, with a significant other and kids to support, times were tough. Rather than give in to temptation for easy money, Gully decided to put his nose to the grindstone and work even harder than he had when he'd been incarcerated. Gully took a full-time job as an air conditioning repairman, but rather than put anything on hold, he put together a portfolio and a pitch packet for Ant in his spare time. As a guy who works a full-time job and also tries to do this channel, let me tell you, it is not easy. Gully kept at it though. He sent his portfolio and the Ant pitch packet out to every publisher that he could think of, and he got turned down by them all. Did he give up? Heck no. He tweaked and revised the package, reworking the pages and replacing stuff that he didn't feel was up to snuff. Nothing seemed to work, but Gully kept at it for 6.5 years. You hear stories of people chasing their dream, but I've got to say, this is impressive. Gully was bound and determined to make something of his talents, and I commend the crap out of that. You hear other industry greats like Sam Keith talk about how long it took them to break into the business, and Todd McFarlane has that super famous story he always tells about being turned down by every publisher in existence multiple times before he finally got his foot in the door at DC. Ironically, eventually Gully was finally approached by someone with a vague offer to do some comic-related images. It was, of course, none other than the Todd father himself. McFarlane approached Gully in either late 2000 or early 2001 with a vague offer of work, possibly in design or perhaps on production art, but most likely for his toy line and not his comic company, from what I can gather. While Gully has never spoken to the details about what they were, he did complete several assignments given to him by McFarlane, according to at least one interview I was able to find, and he patiently waited. Again, nothing came of it. After what must have seemed like forever, Gully finally got his nerve up and called McFarlane asking him what was up. Todd McFarlane told Mario Gully that basically he had just met him at the wrong time. He was heavily vested in toys and not so much so in comics at that second, and he didn't have any work for him or in the foreseeable future. While I'm sure it was pretty crushing news for Gully, McFarlane did say he was, quote, keeping an eye on him, and that Gully was going to be the, quote, next big thing, according to Gully. While he might not have gotten many assignments that saw print, Gully did have at least one illustration show up in an Image comic book that I know of, Violent Messiahs, in September of 2001. Gully repeatedly makes reference to, quote, a lot of free pinups, as in plural illustrations as opposed to a single piece that he did for Image in interviews, though. Despite a lot of nosing around, I couldn't find anything else that he ever did for Image, at least that ever got released. One possibility is his stuff didn't make the cut and got left on the cutting room floor. However, if Gully was working on illustrations for McFarlane toys, and that's where his art was showing up, even promotional art for McFarlane toys where his stuff could have been used, finding details would be next to impossible. It's also a very likely scenario that the work he may be referring to I couldn't find any details about. He also does note that his art shows up in the 10th Muse gallery book, but interestingly, while 10th Muse started out with Image, by the time that the gallery book where Gully's art is indeed included, much to the chagrin of the Grand Comic Books database, didn't come out until 2001. Why is this important? Well, that means that the 10th Muse had already moved from Image to Tidal Wave, where it was self-published, and this is where Gully's art was collected, not during the book's time at Image. This makes it unclear whether Gully did other similar unpaid or perhaps uncredited pinup and illustration for other small publishers like Tidal Wave, and there's just no details cataloged about those releases, as well as raises the question of how long that art had been sitting. There's a decent chance that Gully completed the piece while 10th Muse was still at Image, but they rejected or chose not to use it as the title was slipping in sales for them at the time. When they moved from Image to Tidal Wave, they very likely could have been aware of, or Gully could have sent them that piece, and that's how it wound up being published there. As with much of his career, unfortunately, it's not completely clear exactly how things played out. This was a constant frustration, and I rarely face it when researching such recent happenings. Despite making a pretty big splash at the time, when he finally did make it, unfortunately, many of the details of Gully's career are quickly becoming lost to the annals of time as websites and domains disappear. Trying to research what books Gully has even contributed to beyond Ant is an uphill battle, which is a real shame for a guy who had such a promising future at one point not so very long ago. What is clear is that at this point in his career, Mario Gully was struggling to get his work published, and if things were hard for him at work, home doesn't seem like it was any better. Struggling to get his pinups and other illustrations published while still constantly sending out the Ant promotional packet to any and every publisher that he discovered, things had continued to get more difficult in his personal life as well. Somehow seemingly undeterred and hellbound to make it, Gully, his wife, and his children were living with his father as the meager amount of money he'd managed to save up as an air conditioning repairman had long since run out. Things were bleak, but as always, instead of giving up, Mario Gully decided to push against the odds. With no money of his own left, Gully managed to secure some financial backing from a friend. By this point, Gully had been turned down by basically everyone at least once. He had reviews and critiques from dozens of companies, and he had a pretty good idea of what he needed to change and spiff up. Mario Gully decided to invest the money in better inks as well as improved colors for the Ant pitch portfolio. But he wasn't done there. Gully really stepped out on a limb, and as a kind of testament to how much he really did believe in his creation, he commissioned a cover from none other than J. Scott Campbell himself. It turned out that Campbell actually really liked what he'd seen of Ant, was an early fan of Gully's, which is likely how he was able to afford such a nice piece. You would think that armed with all of this experience and a cover by J. Scott Campbell, someone would want to put out the book. Gully says he was still turned down by everyone. Finally, it seems like Gully was growing weary of the constant rejections and critiques of his work and ideas. Now, mind you, he wasn't tired of comics or Ant. He was just tired of being told no. He decided to start looking into possible ways to finance a self-published version of Ant when a small upstart company reached out, finally showing interest in his creation in 2004. I've never been able to remember their name, but I do remember seeing Ant on their site along with a few other books that actually looked pretty decent. Half because he believed in them and half out of exasperation, it seems, Gully tentatively agreed to work with them, and as the new publisher struggled to get on its feet and figure out how they were going to get books published and distributed and all of that good stuff, Gully received an email out of the blue that would change his life forever. The email from Sean Patrick O'Reilly, owner and operator of Arcana Studios, basically said he hoped Gully hadn't signed a contract yet because they would beat whatever he was going to get. While many Americans might scoff at this, Arcana is no joke. While they might not be Marvel or DC, they are Canada's biggest comic publisher and also have ties to animation and have won a number of awards in the industry for their titles. Arcana was not some fly-by-night operation of people still figuring out what they were doing. They were a well-oiled machine looking for a big book to promote heavily. O'Reilly was offering Gully exactly what he had been looking for, a real home for Ant. And he made a generous offer in addition, a 5-year exclusive contract with Arcana, which from several accounts Gully accepted, but this may or may not be true given what followed. What is clear is that it seemed that Arcana and Gully got along quite well, and it was a solid, mutually beneficial relationship. In early interviews, Gully spoke extremely highly of O'Reilly, going so far as to refer to him and the rest of the Arcana staff as family, and there were numerous announcements throughout the only 4 issues published by Arcana about how well they were getting along with Gully and vice versa. Behind the scenes, though, things had to have been rough to say the least, as Gully got his sea legs and attempted to get some much needed assistance on the fledgling Ant, now under Arcana's auspices, and set for release at the end of 2004. These unseen, tumultuous, behind-the-scenes happenings are probably best reflected in the strangely high turnover of writers on the first volume of Ant. This is especially strange because it only lasted 4 issues. Gully was initially aided by and even credited Matt Nixon as his co-writer on the first issue, touting that Nixon would be involved with the ongoing series. According to interviews at the time, it sounded like Gully and Nixon just couldn't get schedules to mesh, and Nixon had to bow out of the project before it ever really started. But since Ant was designed to work in 4-issue arcs, kind of like miniseries, it was very plausible that Nixon might become involved again at some later point. If you read interviews from a few years later, though, it's clear that Gully and Nixon never saw eye to eye when it came to Ant, although these points of contention have never been made clear to the best of my knowledge, and Nixon was not coming back to the series. He didn't want to, and Gully didn't want him, and that much is clear. They never publicly got into it, but when a writer bows out of a series before the first issue after publicly stating that they're going to be involved, something's going on. What that something was isn't exactly clear. What is clear is this seems to be a kind of repeating cycle for Gully. He meets people and wins them over with his charm and enthusiasm, and then things quickly sour once they start actually working together, and they both seem to kind of part ways amidst unnamed troubles and hurt feelings to varying degrees. This habit would prove to be decidedly problematic for Gully, who keeps his friends and family very close, often involving them with his work and career on a host of levels. When they're getting along and everything is going okay, it's great, and at the time Ant was being published by Arcana, Gully's soon-to-be wife Tina was heavily involved with his career. She not only managed Gully, keeping him on track and schedule, lining up work, and generally managing his career, but Tina Gully was credited with script assistance on issue 2 of Ant. Her contributions to the series were large enough, in fact, that she was named in several of the interviews and articles that I came across from the time. While definitely good at managing Gully from what I can tell, I don't know if Tina had managing him and helping write Ant Inner, and she was subsequently quickly joined by both Ken Levin and Sean Patrick O'Reilly by the 4th issue, which was supposed to wrap up the first story arc. And to be honest, of all the Ant volumes out there, Volume 1 probably did have the best ending, but it didn't necessarily wrap anything up for reasons we'll talk about here in a second. While a lot of people have postulated as to the reasons that Ant only lasted 4 issues at Arcana despite its success, Gully has said in interviews from the start that Ant was written in such a way that stories would be kind of self-contained. While they wouldn't necessarily be numbered or marketed as such, essentially, each arc would be able to be read as a standalone miniseries, an admirable goal to be sure, but the end result, it didn't quite work out like that. Well, actually, the numbering isn't too far off from the miniseries, but the stories, well, they had a nasty habit of never really wrapping up. Looking at the list of writers and contributors on the first 4 issues of the first volume alone, it is not hard to figure out exactly why either. While Ant is the definition of a character not designed by a committee, I'm afraid her story is, well, another story. Speaking of which, as Ant isn't what I would call a mainstream book by any means, despite being published by Image at this point, if you're unfamiliar with the actual premise and story of Ant, I guess now would be an opportune time to clue you in. The story revolves around a young girl, Hannah Washington, an introverted young girl who lives in a more than somewhat troubled home. Her father, although from all looks and appearances a super loving and caring guy, not only has some serious issues with his baby's mama, but he also happens to have done something which is constantly alluded to but never expressly stated, which caused him to get arrested and convicted of that something. This something hangs over his head, but wanting a better life for his daughter, he tries to turn his life around and goes straight. He leaves Hannah's crazy mom, a stripper who's still all hung up on money and drugs and isn't interested in having a kid, let alone raising one. Mind you, this all occurs before the series ever begins, presumably, as again, it's alluded to but never really expressly stated. While this kind of dancing around details is one of the first and finest comic tropes, it feels a little different in Ant. Rather than being intentionally vague, Ant often feels like no one really knew what was going on. Not the characters, and certainly not whoever was writing it. The story jumps around a lot. The writing is incredibly stiff. I could spend days ripping apart the dialogue, and the art is definitely done by someone who is learning from panel to panel, page to page, in a very noticeable way. With all of these warts, one might wonder what would attract anyone to this series. What makes Ant really unique, or I guess made Ant so unique, sadly, was the fact that it was about Hannah Washington, not Ant. Hannah Washington is a real little girl in the book. We follow her struggles and problems in real life throughout the first volume. Ant is just a made-up character she's created to escape this horrible reality that she's surrounded with daily in her journal. It might sound a little silly, but as a guy who's read a lot of comics, I can say not only was it fairly original, but I really liked the concept originally. Even in the first volume, though, there were cracks that showed as other people started tampering with the series. Originally, when Gully was the lone writer, Ant exists only in Hannah's journal as a figment of her imagination and a way to escape. As the story progresses and other writers, I would guess most notably O'Reilly, Ant's knowledge from the imaginary fictitious world she inhabits kind of starts to bleed and leak into Hannah's as the, quote, lines between fiction and reality begin to blur. You never get the feeling that Hannah is going to turn into Ant or anything in the first few issues, and I thought that was really cool. All Hannah wants is to be Ant. If she were Ant, she would be able to fix all this stuff and save all these people, and it's totally not going to happen. She's not going to get superpowers or a super suit and go out and fight crime. And I loved that. It was the thing that really attracted me to the series, and rather interestingly, it was also the source of constant critiques being leveled at Gully for the lack of tension that Ant's adventures could have. While I love the concept, technically, since Ant is a creation of Hannah Washington, a little girl, and only exists in her journals written by her, so there's no real danger. In essence, nothing can ever really happen to Ant. She's not real and therefore can't face any real danger. On one hand, this is absolutely true. To counter this, however, let me begin with the best of my laundry list of complaints about this particular criticism of the first volume. Firstly, are we to be totally unconcerned with Hannah Washington? You know, the girl who invented Ant, the girl who basically is Ant? Isn't there any danger in the fact that Hannah's father is facing a death sentence for a crime he didn't commit? Is there zero intrigue or interest in the fact that Hannah's mom, an estranged stripper, is sleeping with the guy who actually killed the man Hannah's dad is being accused of murdering? I get it. In one sense, nothing can happen to Ant because she's a little girl's creation, but casting that simple fact aside for a single moment, you're left with a vast amount of potential, in my opinion, and none of that requires dragging Ant into the quote, real world. This is all stuff that's happening in Hannah Washington's life, not Ant's. They bleed together only because they're essentially the same being, but Ant's actions don't affect Hannah, while the reverse definitely isn't true. The fact that Ant is a fictitious creation inside of a fictitious universe never bothered me, and I certainly never understood the criticism of Ant not facing any real danger. The Ant fight scenes were basically put there to keep people interested in the more drama and character-driven story that was taking place around it. I know that's hard for a lot of people to understand when they see this book and the way it's written and drawn and constructed, but I really feel like it's the truth. This all notwithstanding, let us really dig into the argument that there can't be any danger to Ant since she isn't, quote, real. When was the last time Superman died and stayed dead? What about Captain America or any number of a million other comic book characters that have died? Does this make their stories lack impact? Perhaps, but if so, this is a fault most of the comic industry is guilty of and in many cases relies on to survive. I also thought, what if Hannah stopped believing in Ant? Would she thereby cease to exist? We could have gotten a story about Ant where she's trapped in this disappearing world all around her, a la the never-ending story. Or what if Hannah had gotten depressed or angry and actually killed off the Ant character? At least in that case, it would have made some actual sense when and if Hannah brought her back to life. Gully took a lot of flack about this for the entirety of the first volume and is well evidenced by the ending to the fourth book, which I am going to step on a limb and say was a contribution or suggestion from one of the other innumerable voices talking in Gully's ear by the time the first volume ended. In interviews, I was interested to find that Gully himself felt the same way I do. He did not understand the criticisms leveled at the book on that level and did his best to retain that angle as long as he could. We both also seem to agree that this criticism is really people just getting upset that it's not really a superhero book. Or at least when it started, it wasn't. Yeah, Gully dressed Ant up with a costume hero, and he had some really great TNA and action in every issue to keep you coming back. But the real story, the story I think Gully was actually trying to tell, was that of Hannah Washington. It's obvious that while the protagonist is a young female writing in her journal, the book is actually about Mario Gully's time in jail, drawing pictures and wishing he could escape like the ant on the windowsill to his cell. It was rather poetic and beautiful if you read it from that angle in some regards, but I'm not sure a lot of people ever understood Ant like that. The character of Ant is completely secondary to the story in a lot of regards, and I loved that about the series. Publishers, on the other hand, could not have been more peeved about it. If you're not giving them a marketable character that eats up 99.9% of a book, beating the crap out of the cockroach or her tits bouncing around, they want nothing to do with it. Ant never got pornographic, despite what some people say. And yes, we'll get there. But when I got past the obviously 90s image-inspired art, I actually really liked what I found despite having initially being turned off by the book's appearance. While there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, adult comics have just never been of much interest to me. Ant never strayed into that territory, at least not in my opinion. Well, until Ant Unleashed, but we'll get there. And Gully's art was always extremely competent for someone who was new to the industry and tackling most every facet of the book himself. At the end of each issue, Gully would share a little bit of information about himself, why he'd done the book, and other little details. It became clear rather quickly that Ant meant a lot to Gully, and he's confirmed several times in interviews that in many ways Ant was a semi-biographical story drawing on his life for inspiration. It was a little confusing. Okay, a lot confusing sometimes. But a lot of independent books are like that, and honestly, I was hooked enough, I kept reading. I wasn't super excited about Ant herself, but I was definitely in the minority, along with Gully, in believing that the really interesting part of and the draw to the book was Hannah Washington, not Ant. As the first arc drew to a close, Ant was really picking up steam, despite the book not being published by Marvel and DC, as well as Gully's somewhat troubled past. Having embraced his roots from the beginning, Gully remained true to his vision for as long as he could, but by the fourth issue, it was clear he was beginning to have to make concessions for the first time. At the end of the first volume, Hannah has a seizure, and when she wakes up, she's a young adult and locked in an insane asylum. She's told that she has schizophrenia and amnesia, and basically what we've read to this point may or may not have been a dream or hallucination. While jolting, I might have let this slide, but in the final panel, we see that Hannah has broken out of the asylum in search of answers through a wall. The shattered rock and crumbling concrete leave little to the imagination, and it's clear from this final panel of the first volume that Hannah has actually transformed into Ant somehow. With all of the interviews that I've ever read and research that I've done, I get the feeling this was done for one of two reasons, neither of which were in greater service of the book, in my opinion. Things had been kind of getting a little bit out of hand for Gully on Ant at the time, but I get the feeling it was really only because he bit off a little more than he could chew, and he was greeted with a great deal more success than anyone had ever anticipated, both as a creator and as a personality. There was somewhat of a scandal when it was revealed the winner of a pinup competition that Gully hosted for Ant was in fact Jessie Nelson, the girlfriend of a fellow Arcana Comics employee. In defense of his decision, Gully would eventually use the illustration not as a pinup, but as a convention-exclusive variant cover to prove that he hadn't chosen Nelson because of anything but her talent. While I suppose a fairly serious way to show your conviction, this was one of the early moments when Gully's aggressive personality began to show from underneath the placid veneer he was working so hard to keep up. He didn't use the illustration as a cover because it was good. He did it because he didn't like being called out or criticized. I mean, no one does, but this would go on to get Gully into some serious trouble before things were all said and done. The Jessie Nelson situation blew over pretty quick. She wasn't getting paid $1 million, and it was just a little internet forum competition. Some people got their feelings hurt, while others felt that Gully was selling out for the first time, but Arcana was still firmly behind him and determined to put the negativity in the past and promote what was easily their biggest title at the moment. The first issue of Ant had sold out almost immediately in a matter of only days and quickly commanded a second printing. They had done several variant covers for the first issue initially, including a black and white sketch version of the J. Scott Campbell cover, and after the sellout success of those releases, Arcana produced even more of them for the second printing as they started to really hit the conventions and make the rounds with Ant. After only a year, Mario Gully was starting to be a name people talked about, and Ant was on its way to becoming an actual hit book, transcending any condescension or question that might result from the book not being put out by Marvel, DC, or even Image for that matter. Gully had proven himself to be invaluable in the publishing department to Arcana, who was starved for fan, media, and critic attention on their books, which were constantly being perceived as outsider publications to the industry, despite winning a Joe Shuster Award in their first year of publication, and as I mentioned, being Canada's largest publisher of comics. Having only founded their comics division a year earlier in 2004, O'Reilly and the rest of Arcana seemed dead set on seriously taking care of their biggest talent, who happened to be Mario Gully at that point. Having offered him, and by all accounts, Gully having signed a 5-year exclusive contract with the company anyway, It was announced at the end of the third issue of Ant that Mario Gully had been named a partner and the third editor in Arcana's comic publishing department. To anyone looking in or following the story, for Gully, who literally began writing this series behind bars, things were finally falling into place. He had left his past behind him, he was getting books out, and they were looking better and better every time. He was receiving more fan and critical attention, and Arcana was throwing some serious weight behind promoting and rewarding Gully for his hard work and achievements. It's the kind of situation I think most creators dream of, but things were not as they seemed behind the panels. While always difficult, Hannah Washington's world was crumbling in the comic, and so too it seems Gully was teetering on the verge of complete self-annihilation. While Arcana was publishing Ant, it featured an ongoing page at the end written by Mario Gully titled Last Words. It was usually ruminations on what was going on in his life and little bits of information about his life or something related to Ant. While letter pages were a dying thing by 2005, not only did every issue of Ant feature this Last Words page from Gully, but at least one page of letters from fans called the Ant Bed. I love getting insight into what's going on with the title, and there's nothing like interacting with your fan base, in my opinion. So I loved the fact that Gully and Arcana chose to include these, and I'd oftentimes read them before I read the actual issue, as they would offer little bits of insight into Gully's mindset and kind of set the mood or explain a little of what was going on with that month's story in Ant. When the fourth issue came out, the Last Words page had an apocryphal statement boldly printed. Quote, "I am and always will be Arcana," professed Gully, who less than a year later would be at Image Comics. Following the publication of the fourth issue and the end of the first volume, something happened, although I was never able to pin down exactly what it was. I don't know if Gully had a falling out with Arcana, he was under the spell of hero worship, or it was just like a better deal, but Mario Gully almost immediately moved Ant from Arcana, who had opened their doors and seemed to be really trying to go above and beyond to take care of him, to the obviously larger Image Comics. Having been a massive Image fan, it was a dream come true for Gully at first, especially with the support of Erik Larsen, who had been an outspoken fan of the series for some time. If I were to guess, as soon as the book really started taking off, Larsen started courting Gully, and it just took him a little while to lure him away from Arcana. I don't know if he even really had to say much, considering Image was where Gully had really wanted Ant from the beginning anyway. While at the time I'm sure it not only felt like a good idea, but a victory, this move to Image would ultimately prove to be a disastrous one, not only for Gully, but for Ant as well. While Larsen did enjoy the book and had been a rather unabashed and outspoken fan, he was also one of the critics of the book who felt Ant was never in any real danger. As I've said, I completely disagree with this assessment of not only the story but the entire book, but I'm just a jerk with a YouTube channel, and by this time in 2006, Erik Larsen was running Image. So if he wanted to bring Gully on board and hype him up, I'm sure it was hard to say no. Image would be able to promote the series in ways that Arcana couldn't even begin to dream of yet. And it also seems that an integral part of this entire situation is Mario Gully looking for a friend. He seems to have desperately yearned for someone who understood him and would have his back when it came to the crunch. The climactic final battle with her arch nemesis, the cockroach, in the third issue of the first volume of Ant really feels like Gully expressing how desperately he wanted someone who understood Ant and him, and I think this probably factored pretty heavily into Gully making the move to Image as much as anything else. He saw in Larsen a kind of kindred spirit. Gully had grown up idolizing his work, and it was probably easy to lose sight of a lot of things as a result. In Gully's head, there was finally a professional out there who understood that all he wanted was to do his thing, to make his comic book his way. I think Sean Patrick O'Reilly was pushing for certain changes in the book, and that maybe the money wasn't what Gully had been hoping it would be, despite Ant being Arcana's biggest book, basically. Larsen, on the other hand, had infinitely more funds and power at his disposal, was an outspoken fan, and ran Image, the company that had inspired Gully to start making comics in the first place. And Larsen very well could have been that friend too. He could have helped Gully do things his way and help get Ant out to a larger audience while allowing Gully to improve on his art and a few other things that could use some work, but giving him the creative freedom to explore these subjects, given that Ant was already a successful book. It wasn't like you needed to reinvent the wheel and introduce people to an entirely new character or anything, and in Gully's head there were probably nothing but upsides to this decision. Things did not play out that way, unfortunately, though. As I mentioned, the first volume ends on somewhat of a cliffhanger, as more and more of Hannah's escapist Ant universe has began to leak into our world. There are a few little clues and bits about this starting in the second issue, but she has some sort of seizure or something at the end of the third issue, yet we don't hear anything about it at all in the fourth issue. Instead, the police catch the real killer, her dad gets off death row, her mom decides to stop being such a D-bag and take care of her kid, and everything seems to be wrapped up in this neat little package. That's when Hannah wakes up in a straitjacket, locked up in an insane asylum, aged like a decade in a single page. We're told that she has schizophrenia and that she's been locked up for years, ever since her father was executed. On the final page, it's revealed that she's broken out of the insane asylum by breaking through one of the walls, and all that's left behind is this vial from one of Ant's stories. The not so subtle implication is that Hannah has finally achieved her dream and has or is becoming Ant. Well, this very well could have been Gully's plan for the series from the start. Not only do I doubt that given what I've read about the series, but the major problem is it feels really forced. While Ant is a kind of roller coaster and bounces around a lot as a book anyway, this whole plot of Hannah's transformation is jammed in the last 5 pages of a 40-page long story. Obviously, there had to be some setup for their next series, a hook to get people to come back. But this reads a lot more like Gully giving in to the constant criticism of Ant not being real or in real danger more than anything else. I loved the first volume, warts and all, because it seemed unafraid to be such an openly non-traditional superhero book. And for me, this felt like the first time Gully had given in to anyone about anything having to do with Ant. For the first time, he was giving in to peer pressure, and you could almost see the next page where it's revealed that Hannah has finally become Ant. Now Ant is going to be the main character of the book, and how the cockroach is going to be real now too, and there's going to be real danger. It was super disappointing for me, but I totally get it. Say what you want about the mean-spirited ways they go about it, but I think that Garth Ennis and Alan Moore have some pretty valid points when it comes to superheroes choking comic stands and really dragging the industry down in a lot of ways. There's so much more to comics than just superheroes, and I think that Ant is a great example of just what Ennis and Moore are constantly on about. You have this great independent series, really rough around the edges and in need of some serious TLC for mass consumption, yes, but a pretty interesting and shockingly original story in a lot of ways. And what do they do with it? Image convinces the creator to ditch everything that made his book different and turn the title and his characters, a character born of his incarceration, a literal incarnation of all of his hopes and dreams, into just another superhero. As steps were taken to make Hannah Washington and, more importantly, Ant ready for mass consumption, more and more of what made her so interesting and original was slowly being drained from the title. And if Larsen and Image were aiming to fix some of the rather uneven writing that he complained about in the past, well, let's just say they didn't exactly do a bang-up job. While the move to Image may have seemed like a good thing at the time, it was just another step towards the edge of the cliff for Mario, Gully, and Ant. Image is a much larger publisher than Arcana. If they choose to put their weight behind you, you're going to get a lot more exposure than even if someone like Arcana is putting everything they've got into promoting you and getting your name out there. This may have been one of the major motivating factors that led to Gully's departure for Image. The money didn't hurt either, though. While the first issue had sold out its first and second printings, featuring no less than 9 different covers, and Ant was certainly the most successful thing that Arcana had, from his reaction to what came next, I'm guessing that the then father of 4 wasn't making an inordinate amount of money. When Erik Larsen called Mario Gully with the sales figures on the first issue, he literally collapsed to his knees crying in joy. There was that much difference. And speaking of difference, this probably also sent the wrong messages to Gully, who I'm not saying is greedy or anything, but obviously had a lot riding on the series. He'd spent years trying to get Ant off the ground, and despite its success, he was still struggling to make a living in the industry. So when the sales numbers on that first issue for Image came in, it must have seemed like it required giving up a little bit of what made Ant so special in the first place to make the book more widely accessible and thereby successful and thereby capable of providing him with a living. This is the case for many, if not most, characters you see in mainstream books. Little by little, they're drained of their originality and differences from other things until they fit into these neat, tiny little definable containers that we're able to label and explain. The problem is, each time you tinker with that formula, you get a little closer to losing whatever that original spark that made the idea so special in the first place was. And to be fair to Larsen, it does appear he was right. While the first volume of Ant had managed to capture the public's attention, and there was a lot of talk about it inside of the industry, it definitely hadn't lit the newsstands on fire. The second volume for Image was a horse of a different color entirely. The first issue didn't just sell out, so did the second printing. On top of that, the book had already been overprinted and overshipped to retailers to begin with. Ant did pretty dang well when Image released it, managing to sell about 12,000 copies of the first printing alone. If that sounds a little underwhelming, you need to realize the book sitting just above Ant that month was the adjectiveless Superman title, which only managed to sell 100 more copies. This was due, no doubt, in no small part to Erik Larsen, who had thrown his full weight behind the project. For me, though, Larsen absolutely wrecked Ant, and I don't mean that as a slight on Larsen or anything. I just mean that he keyed in on every aspect of the book that I personally didn't like. To his credit, he saw a dyed-in-the-wool 1992 Image comic in Ant, and he was determined to bring that to the surface, and for his part, he was extremely successful, at least at first. Honestly, as someone who read the first volume and enjoyed it for what it was, warts and all, the move to Image legitimately destroyed Ant for me. It went from a rough around the edges piece of auteur exploration of angst and desperation, as well as ultimately redemption, into just another Image Comics superhero book. I think a lot of people picked it up as a collector's piece since it's an Image first issue, and I don't think those readers were ever going to stick around with Ant, and it doesn't matter what you do. On the other hand, those of us that had read and enjoyed the first volume felt a little bit betrayed in a lot of ways, I think. And little by little, one by one, we kind of wandered off and lost interest. Gully and Image were tampering with the formula, and in doing so, while they initially managed to sell a few more issues and did successfully integrate Ant into the mainstream Image universe continuity, I think he drove a lot of us away ultimately. When Gully missed a month for the first time, only 2 issues into his Image run, and numbers began to level out after sales dipped following that, with orders on the issue 4 solicitation at only a fraction of what they had been. In less than a year, Gully was selling less than 5,000 copies a month of his book, which he was trying to make a living off of. And I think the reality of what he had done, compromising and completely changing the book, all seemingly for no reason at this point, started really setting in. By this time in 2005, Gully was nearing what would be the end of a 14-year-long marriage, and his life was, simply put, falling apart. Feeling absolutely out of control, his book in what seemed like free fall and nowhere left to turn, rather than let his past get the better of him and resort to old habits, Gully has said he did his best to remain on the straight and narrow. According to interviews, he went to church, he taught Sunday school, and then when that didn't work, he decided to up and move to Las Vegas, but we'll get to that in a second. While he could never have known it, if we were viewing one of Hannah Washington's journal entries, this is the point where we would pull back to her shocked and horrified face and a word bubble where she was emphatically screaming, "No! Don't do it!" over and over again. Gully had actually become monetarily successful, or at least enough that those around him often thought that he had a lot more than he did. And as Ice Cube once said, with power comes money, with money comes greed. Again, I'm not busting on Gully or making any judgments about the guy, but he got his teeth capped and he had kind of an entourage that went with him to a lot of places by this point. Eventually, he was kind of surrounded by these hangers-on and fair-weather friends who all wanted a piece of the action. By his own admission, they were all whispering in his ear, and Gully started to get more erratic and difficult to deal with. While he might not have slipped back into a life of crime, there's a lot of truth to the old adage, you are the company you keep, in a lot of ways. While he had been late on the final issue of the first volume of Ant, this was nothing egregious to me at the time, although I did kind of roll my eyes when I read the notes in the back from Gully himself, emphatically explaining why the issue had been late. There had been a bunch of hurricanes in his hometown. He'd had personal obligations. It was like, hey, it's okay. You were late on a book. It happens. Learn from it and move on. But Gully doesn't seem like the kind of guy who likes to lose face, and thus you got this profusion of what really read like excuses. I mean, there was not one but 3 hurricanes that hit his hometown, but he still goes on to mention that he had personal appearances and stuff on top of that. Like, dude, if you're going to hit me with 3 hurricanes, just call it a day. You don't need to add stuff about conventions and stuff in there. But again, at this point, right then and there, I don't think Gully was the kind of guy who could afford to lose face in his eyes. He automatically would go on the defensive, and this would prove to be a big problem as he continued on with Image. While Gully might have gone to church and Sunday school to try and deal with stuff, I don't get the feeling his friends were those same kind of folks. This, teamed with Mario Gully's inability to lose face, were about to blow up. After less than a year with Image, Ant would be at the center of a scandal that seemed to get picked up by every media outlet there is that covers comics and quickly spread like wildfire. Now let's be clear, Ant has always been racy, to say the least. That was kind of the point of the book in a lot of ways. Gully came up with Ant while he was in jail. She was wish fulfillment in so many more ways than one. He came up with the character while drawing illustrations for other inmates, and I'll just let you think that one over for a second. The stories in Volume 1 often show the ant character scantily clad at best, and while there's no actual intercourse or anything, sex and sexuality obviously compromise a big part of what Ant is all about. It was one of her big attractions to a lot of readers. I can say this rather unequivocally because it's actually the thing that drove me away from the series initially. I got over it and was able to see Ant for what it was, or at least what I think it was. But as is often the case, there were others who simply could not or would not take Ant as anything more than a demeaning, misogynistic title that was a blight on women everywhere. Yes, I think there are series out there like that. No, I don't think Ant was one of those titles in any way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, what I can say is that I do think as soon as the title switched to Image, it feels like the book took a very definite turn in the direction of being more aimless TNA as compared to the more contemplative, maybe story-driven stuff that you saw in the Arcana volume. I don't think the blame can be laid at Erik Larsen or even Mario Gully's feet alone, as I get the feeling there were a lot of voices vying for control over Gully and his creation by now. The quality of the story might not have been what it once was, but Gully had obviously enjoyed the benefits of having a professional studio of illustrators around. When you look at the art for the first issue of the Image series, which is less than a year out from his last work on the Arcana stuff, it's crazy. It wasn't just his art that had improved either. His pacing and storytelling was dramatically improving as well. While the first volume had been more than competent, it did feel a bit amateurish in a lot of ways at some points. Many of those rough edges were now very well hidden underneath a new, slicker, much more attractive all-around appearance. While he'd often been compared to Greg Capullo, who is obviously his biggest influence when looking at his work, when you see that first Image issue, you can tell that Gully, who was still inking his own work, had really taken advantage of being surrounded by the level of talent that he was at Image, and it's the first time his inking really reaches that Capullo level of intricacy and detail. The art was improving from page to page, and I don't know if this was just Mario Gully seeing what he could get away with, or demonstrating what he was into, or if Larsen or Image pushed the idea on him, or what. But the second volume of Ant has all these useless shots of a now adult Hannah Washington in booty shorts with guys checking her out all the time. It gets so old so fast. There had always been a hypersexualized part of Ant, which was one of its big draws for a lot of people, but even the grade school bully has tits in the flashback scene in issue 1 of the Image series, if you don't believe me. It was tiresome at points, to say the least. I didn't like it, but I didn't get upset about it or anything. It wasn't offensive to me, and I think that anyone who says this kind of rampant over-sexualization of certain things and just an exaggerated level of eroticism and sex in the book in general came out of nowhere wasn't paying any attention to the first volume. I mean, there's a shot in the first volume where Ant actually jumps onto this guy's head and uses her crotch to either suffocate the guy or break his neck with her thighs. It's not super clear which. The shot of his face buried right in her crotch, that sure is though. And remember that panel because it's going to come up in the test at the end of the video, boils and ghouls. Extreme to an extent to begin with, it does seem when Image started handling the series, the intrinsic sexuality and sex appeal of the series got turned up to 11, for lack of a better term. It felt labored and a little bit tired, and I actually get the feeling that this was either being pushed on Gully or encouraged by certain individuals he might have been surrounded by. Gully usually reveals a lot with his word choices, even when he doesn't know it, And when you read between the lines in interviews during the fallout of all of this, it really does feel like someone was whispering into his ear and telling him to spice things up for sales and this and that and keep going and make it even sexier. And he kind of gave into temptation or pressure, or maybe the freedom. Whatever it was that led to this rampant sex and constant need to show gratuitous shots of TNA was annoying, though. The entire character seemed completely different, and not in a good way. They tampered with the character, turning her into an amnesiac with like Jason Bourne level fighting abilities, and this was when you started getting shots like the almost full page of Hannah's butt in a thong from issue 4. More and more. The writing had always been kind of hit or miss on the first volume, admittedly, with so many differing voices by the end, and Erik Larsen has basically said that they aim to fix that. What they did to fix that was shoehorn her into mainstream Image continuity, just rubbing your face in it, with not only the obligatory Savage Dragon appearance, but also Image's heaviest hitter, Spawn, in not one, but 2 issues. In the first year, Larsen had kind of discovered Gully, and he had been the one responsible for getting him over to Image, so Savage Dragon showing up was almost obligatory, but not Spawn. McFarlane didn't just let them toss Spawn into whatever books they wanted. It means McFarlane likely saw something in Ant as well, and goes a long way in backing up the stories that Gully shared about his work from McFarlane Productions that I couldn't find details about. This should also give you some idea of the kind of push that Image was giving Ant. While much of this was a culmination of Gully's childhood hopes and dreams, it was also the beginning of the end for not only Ant, but eventually Mario Gully as well, ironically. Ant had been dedicated to Todd McFarlane, so Spawn showing up in his first Image story arc was definitely a dream come true for Gully, which does make me wonder if he was perhaps pushing the more extreme angles of the book, inadvertently neglecting stuff like the story to impress his idols in a way. In the end, it doesn't really matter. The changes made to the book equated to reducing Ant to a superhero, and not just that, but a superhero in a universe of superheroes, and a somewhat unremarkable and derivative one at that. If big splashy images and pretty women are your thing, then Ant Volume 2 has got you covered. And I want to be clear, I'm not bagging on that stuff. It's not necessarily what interests me in a book, but there's nothing wrong with it. There were and are obviously plenty of people interested in that kind of thing, and Mario Gully seems to have been giving the people what they want. The fans, the publisher, everyone. No one raised an eyebrow when we got an entire page of Hannah's butt stuffed into a thong, or when we saw pictures of naked women on her walls a few times, which makes the whole issue 8 incident a little puzzling to me, to say the least. As the year progressed, Gully really started to hit a clip on Ant. While there were some missed deadlines, if you look at those early Arcana issues and then the Image stuff, it's just worlds apart. Gully was obviously driven to not only impress the artists that he had grown up idolizing and were giving him a chance, but seems to have been soaking up everything he could from the other professionals at Image he was getting a chance to hobnob with for the first time. This all very nearly came to a screeching halt with a single issue, however. In issue 8 of Ant, several new characters show up, and there's a visit to a strip club, accompanied by some obligatory partial nudity. It's not really that crazy or anything. You can clearly see nude women in pictures hanging on Hannah's wall as early as the 5th issue, if you're paying attention. Maybe. And this is a big maybe, but maybe if this had been the issue's only offense, Gully might have gotten off clean on this one. That was not the case, though. On top of the nudity, in a book that did not bear an adult reader's warning, Gully decided to include several, and I do mean several, instances of the F-bomb. At one point, it's even printed in huge, bold black letters in the center of a splash page. Retailers were not pleased about the unsolicited nudity, though I think anyone selling Ant to little kids at this point knew why they were buying Ant. It's like listening to the guys who sold tobacco pipes and talked about not knowing people smoked pot out of them. It just comes off hypocritically. I don't think it's the case, but the book began to be labeled as borderline pornographic as a result. Either way, though, that's the key here. Borderline. It never really crossed the line art-wise, but the obscenity was a different matter. While his book hadn't always been seen in the most positive light, I think somehow Gully went from being a nuisance to being a danger and a threat who had to be dealt with. As more retailers became irate and there was more fallout in Image's direction, it was clear that whatever Gully had been trying to accomplish with this stunt, unless it was getting himself fired, was an unmitigated failure. It seems Image did little, if anything, to shield Gully from the flood of angry social media posts and the flood of negative media coverage that ensued, and by all rights, this very well could have been the end for Mario, Gully, and Ant again. But it wasn't. Mario Gully did something I think few other people would have the courage to do in his position. He took responsibility for his actions. Instead of going radio silent and trying to sit out the storm or doubling back and trying to save face, Mario Gully manned up and apologized. It was pretty amazing, actually. Not only did he own up to the fact that he had crossed the line, but he also went on to say that he had kind of lost sight of the story, as well as that the nudity and profanity in the issue had been unnecessary. He continued by saying Ant was his book. It was his call, his responsibility, and he was taking responsibility for it. Reading the apology really is pretty awesome. I was completely ready for Gully to go on the offensive, or to completely bow down and finally just admit defeat. But he didn't do either. Instead, he figured out what had gone wrong, what he had done to make that happen, and what needed to be done to fix it, and addressed those issues publicly and in a timely and professional manner. If more people were capable of this, and in some cases, I think even given the opportunity to be capable of it, the industry would be a far better place. This wasn't Marvel or DC yelling at someone because they drew a Batawang. This was a creator responding to the valid complaints and arguments of the people reading and buying his book, and I cannot even begin to applaud Mario Gully enough for this. He handled everything about this situation with aplomb, and his apology does not come off as placating or insincere. He really took what was important and valid about the complaints and the concerns to heart, and I wish he'd been given more of an opportunity to explore where that kind of mindset would have taken him. While unfortunately this was not to be the case, Ant had a new lease on life, and as I mentioned, his art had been steadily evolving. Issue after issue, Gully was improving from page to page, and by this point in 2006, Gully was really coming into his own as an artist. Just as this was happening, in August and September of 2006, Gully was wrapping up work on his first project for none other than Marvel Comics. Legendary staffer Roy Thomas had tapped Gully for a Marvel Illustrated adaptation of Treasure Island, strange enough. The work Gully turned in really was nothing short of amazing. As I said before, he'd really been stepping up his game month after month in the pages of Ant, despite the lackluster story that was literally all over the place by this point, to the extent it's not even really worth discussing. The Treasure Island work, though, was without a doubt the best stuff he'd ever done up to that point. Gully was forced to work on pages for the first time where he could not rely on a beautiful woman to sell the image. The work was great. It was done on time from what I understand, and there's even quotes from Marvel editor Ralph Macchio praising Gully's work on the series and his continued improvement as the pages came in from that period. Marvel Illustrated Treasure Island came out only 4 months after the Ant incident. Needless to say, it was released to little fanfare or acclaim. Whatever steam a Marvel Illustrated adaptation would have had by this point was completely diminished by the fact I think Marvel didn't really want anything to do with Gully anymore. They didn't even go so far as to distance themselves or anything. They just dumped the book on the market and never called Gully back. Just as his relationship with Marvel was completely imploding, apparently so was his marriage. Gully separated from his wife Tina of 14 years, who had helped with a ton of different facets of Ant and basically managed Gully's career in the past. They'd been having serious problems for a while, and as I mentioned, he had tried going back to church and even teaching Sunday school to escape from his troubles and try to keep his nose clean. When this didn't work and his marriage finally ended, Gully disastrously chose to essentially try and flee his life, relocating along with his 4 children to Las Vegas. Mario Gully hastily packed his bags and his kids up in the car and headed for their new home, but they ended up flipping the car while they were on the way. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, but the vehicle was totaled. And Gully was even more demoralized than ever before. On top of this, despite the fact I think he handled things well publicly, his relationship with Image had soured following the issue 8 incident, and they'd stopped publishing Ant only 3 issues later. Following his relocation, Marvel distancing themselves from him and his Treasure Island release, and a palpable lack of support from Image, which you can tell Gully was kind of hurt by in interviews, he was so depressed, he wasn't even drawing. He managed to get things together enough to do a new Ant project, Ant Unleashed, this time for Big City Comics in 2008. The series was basically supposed to be an adult take on Ant. I'm not going to get into this one here, really. I almost feel like it's taking cheap shots. I think by this point, Gully was probably not only hurting creatively, but for money as well. Let's just say Ant Unleashed was planned as a 6-issue miniseries, and only 3 issues ever came out, leaving the series on a cliffhanger ending that no one is clamoring to read the end of. Gully then managed to successfully cross-license Ant in a series where she also appeared called Omega 1. If Ant Unleashed was bad, I have no idea how to explain how painful Omega 1 is. And thankfully, since Gully didn't write or draw that series, I don't have to. By this time, any details about Mario Gully are basically impossible to find. His old site had long since been taken down. No one at Image was interested in him, and Marvel had given him the cold shoulder. Even his attempt to pander to the adult market section was a flop. Gully was reaching the bottom of the barrel, and I think he knew it as well as anyone else. While he's never expressly stated as such in interviews, I think if you read between the lines, it's not hard to see what was going on. Gully has openly admitted that he was getting some really bad advice from everyone around him, and there was a palpable lack of support from Image when he came under fire, which I feel like he kind of really resents, having grown up worshiping those guys. I'm not saying he's right or wrong, I'm just saying you can almost hear him saying it in between the lines in a lot of interviews. He was absolutely overwhelmed, trying to basically do the entire Ant book on his own. In the past, his wife had been intrinsically tied to his work career, and I think without her, it was not long before Gully completely crashed and burned. Refusing to quit even then, though, Gully struggled on for a few months, and then, miraculously, work for Marvel began again. Gully did a Hulk story, an Exiles short, and a pirate-themed follow-up with Roy Thomas, Kidnapped, all in a matter of months for them in 2009. And then that was over. And by that, I basically mean Mario Gully's career. It wasn't just Marvel that had stopped calling. Honestly, I think that the work for Marvel had either already been agreed upon or was finished by the time that Gully hit the front page of the paper with the ant incident. Then, following a series of behind-the-scenes fights, which have never been fully detailed, but resulted in his relationship with Image basically being trashed as well, it seemed that was all she wrote for Mario Gully. He promptly dropped off the face of the planet following this, and I'm not joking, it really just seemed like he vanished. In actuality, Gully seems to have been falling back into old habits. Between 2009 and 2012, he started talking to a woman online after his marriage disintegrated. He then subsequently chose to move his entire family to Las Vegas to live with this woman, who turned out to be a complete psycho, according to Gully. This was the trip where they flipped his car, and this was how Mario Gully came to be essentially homeless. After falling out with the woman that they had moved to live with, who was supposed to provide housing, Gully had no way of paying rent. He hadn't worked professionally, as far as I know, in some time, and according to one interview I found, he plainly admitted he was burnt out and frustrated from his years in the industry and turned back to old habits to make some easy rent money. In July of 2012, Mario Gully was arrested and pleaded guilty to charges of robbery. Once again, it seemed like this was to be the end of the man who had managed to raise himself out of the ashes of poverty and jail time to create a wildly successful creator-owned property. Instead, it would prove to be yet another failed opportunity to turn his life around. Despite pleading guilty, when the judge found out that Mario Gully was a comic book artist, he let him off with probation rather than have him serve any time. Yes, you heard that right. The judge's niece or his nephew happened to be a big comic fan, and this is the reason that Gully has publicly given that the judge let him off. Just as word was spreading about his release from custody, more news about Gully surfaced. This time, the shocking revelation that in utter desperation, with no money to fund his move and wanting to get away from his life at any cost, quite literally, Mario Gully had sold the rights to his precious creation to Erik Larsen. The same Erik Larsen who had failed to come to his aid following the release of Ant Issue 8. But Larsen planned on bringing the series back, and hiring Mario Gully for art duties was a no-brainer. Gully had a small but loyal group of readers that really seemed to do their best to follow him wherever he went and whatever he did. After 3 years, Gully was set for his big comeback. And this time, things should have been easy. Larsen was going to be handling the writing and the production. All he had to do was draw. This was supposed to be the easy part. It was the thing that Gully was good at. And he is good at it, in my opinion. He's always been competent, but following that initial Image run, he had vastly improved, and some of his later work from this period is absolutely gorgeous. Larsen wrote up a rough script, drew some thumbnails, tossed together a few layout pages, and sent them to Gully. Things seemed to be going fine. When Mario Gully sent the pages back to Larsen, though, the shit quite literally hit the fan. What's crazy is this whole thing started over one panel, one single itty-bitty little tiny panel. In Larsen's script and layout, there's a group of armed guards coming down a corridor to attack Ant, and she was supposed to jump behind a guy and use him as a human shield according to Larsen's layouts and script. Apparently, Gully didn't exactly follow Larsen's layouts to a T, though. Ant was his creation, after all, so I don't think it was inordinately strange for him to think it appropriate he might take some artistic liberties and even perhaps have a better sense of what some pages should be laid out and look like. None of this, however, is what he chose to change. Instead, Gully made a small, simple, and seemingly needless change. Instead of jumping behind the guard and using him as a human shield, she jumped on his face. and used her crotch to either suffocate the guy or snap his neck with her thighs. Sound familiar? Well, it should. I told you this would be on the test, boils and ghouls. Remember that panel from the Arcana run? Well, Gully did that instead of Ant using the guy like a human shield. As Gully would quite publicly state when asked about the change, her suit can deflect bullets with no problem, so having her use the guy as a human shield did not make sense to him. It was a small thing, and you would think that changing it would be no big deal. You would be very, very, very wrong. When Larsen sent notes back that it needed to be changed, well, it was, as they say, on like Donkey Kong. Gully immediately took to social media, absolutely eviscerating Erik Larsen. He called him everything from a phony to a liar. Gully never resulted to out and out calling him a string of obscenities in any posts that I could find, but his rants definitely had more than their fair share of foul language when you read back over them. And that's just what they were, too. Rants. To be honest, I can totally see both sides of this one. So on one hand, Ant is Mario Gully's creation. It was his baby, and I don't care if you sell it or you give it away or someone takes it, whatever. That's your baby. It always will be, and you'll always probably see it that way, whether you realize it or not. When he saw the layouts, I have no doubt that Gully meant absolutely no offense. I don't think he set out to change Larsen's layouts because he thought they sucked or anything like that. I say and honestly believe this despite what Mario Gully claimed in posts at the time during the heat of battle, so to speak. I think Gully saw a small thing, something he had done, while admittedly not in an Image issue. It had been in an Ant comic before, and no one had batted an eye. It was a little thing. It didn't impact the story too much, and for Gully, it didn't make sense for Ant to use him as a shield since bullets didn't really hurt her. So he changed it. Now, to be fair to Erik Larsen, we have to take a few things into account here. Not only had he sold this character to Erik Larsen, it was apparently at Mario Gully's insistence, not Larsen's, in order to fund this crazy move of his to Las Vegas. Add to this, the last time Ant had shown up in the headlines was because of sexually questionable material, and you have a recipe for disaster on your hands. That issue 8 debacle, I think, is the big thing here. It had left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, apparently, and Gully quickly fired back about what some of the ridiculously brutal and sexually explicit stuff that Image mainline books, such as The Walking Dead, were allowed to get away with, which is totally fair. He's not wrong. But The Walking Dead hadn't been put under a microscope, and its creator forced to sell his creation because of the disastrous outcome of sexually questionable material in an issue of his book. Ant had been. Erik Larsen wanted to bring her back, but this time he was going to be sure to cross his I's and dot his T's. While I can see both sides of this argument, to be completely honest, drawing what he was told was Mario Gully's job. It was not his book anymore. He chose to sell it, and whatever Erik Larsen chose to do with it was his call. Bringing Mario Gully onto the book almost seemed like an olive branch peace offering to me at the time. Given the fact that Mario Gully had chosen to take the character and leave Image when he struck out on his own. Gully was on probation. No one would hire him, and the last headlines he got, well, all of the headlines that he seemed to get, had never been good. And now he was changing stuff and putting a guy burying his head in Ant's crotch in a comic with provided layouts. Larsen, while extremely restrained in his responses to Gully's continued bullying, made it clear he was done. This was it. Mario Gully was not going to be working on Ant, and it did not matter how much he kicked and screamed about it on message boards, forums, or any other number of social media outlets. Sadly, in retrospect, Gully has said he can totally see himself just nailing the lid to his coffin shut here, and he's even gone so far as to admit that his initial responses weren't just out of line, they were plain wrong. You have to remember, Gully was still surrounded by all these fake people. The kind of people you don't want to lose face in front of. The kind of people you want to impress. I can only describe the exchange as a public pissing match between Mario Gully, who is determined to goad Erik Larsen into a public fight, and Larsen, who conversely was determined to not allow it to sink to that level. In retrospect, it's actually kind of sad looking at a lot of Larsen's posts. He was young and had money and had friends that did some stupid crap. Rob Liefeld, I'm looking in your direction. So we get the feeling Larsen knew what was going on with Mario Gully. That being said, he knew he couldn't stop it, and he sure wasn't going to sully his reputation or waste his time fighting with someone like this again. Instead, Larsen just kind of said how sad it was that stuff had worked out like this, and Ant was put on a shelf, leaving the series on an indefinite cliffhanger from issue 11. I don't know what Mario Gully thought he was going to accomplish by getting on the internet and basically trying to publicly bully Erik Larsen, but Erik Larsen was not backing down and letting him draw Ant again. That's for sure. In the end, what he did manage to accomplish was not only ending his career, but Ant's as well. Larsen's plate was full. He was busy, and let's be honest, he didn't really have to worry about getting an Ant book out. He owned the property, so anytime he felt like trying to recoup on the lost money, he simply could pull her out of his back pocket and do just that. But he never did. Gully is either one of the most driven and talented dudes ever, or he's completely insane. After months of research and reading, I'm still not entirely sure which. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Either way, by this point, no one would have Gully. I think he'd burned his bridges with Arcana pretty well when he took off for Image, who he then had a falling out with and a subsequent feud with, which had resulted in a basic industry-wide ban from most of the major publishers. So Gully just did what he had with Ant so many years before. He spent 2013 putting the pieces together and came out of the gate swinging with a completely original creation. Bug. When he was unable to raise any interest from publishers for the property, Gully said he would just put Bug out himself. I get the feeling that despite the fact he wasn't, quote, letting anyone get in his way when he found out how cost prohibitive actually printing books was, he was quickly forced to reconsider this approach. He then began to make numerous public statements and appeals in an effort to attract investors for not only Bug, but other properties as well. He promised that in exchange for their investment, he would give them a percentage of whatever he made, and then it was a percentage of whatever he created. And then those posts disappeared, and I get the feeling someone from Image might have made it pretty clear that Bug was not going to fly, all pun intended. So Gully did what he always did. He went back to the drawing board, and I swear to God, by this point in my reading, I almost could not believe it. I kept looking at my computer screen and saying, he went back? But he did. This time, though, it was no poor imitation of his previous works. Instead, Gully pushed himself to the absolute artistic limits, and even during the halcyon days of comics on Kickstarter receiving any kind of attention, he managed to attract interest from several of the major outlets, including Bleeding Cool about his next project, Dirty Bones. And before you completely roll your eyes, get this, they liked it. They actually complimented his stuff and talked about how much evolution and growth it showed when compared to his other stuff, which was not unimpressive itself. This boded well for the book. And the creator, who many had simply written off as another casualty of easy success and fame. There was buzz and a lot of excitement about the book, and then the campaign launched, and nothing happened. I think they got just over a third of the $50,000 goal. It wasn't close, I'll say that. This time, Gully did not bounce back like he usually did, though. Looking at the art, I get the feeling he really did put his all into Dirty Bones, and when it didn't get funded, he felt pretty well defeated. There's a big part of me that hopes, just like the original Ant book, he completed Dirty Bones on spec, and somewhere in his archive, there is a completed issue that we will see in some compilation in 20 years when people realize how cool Gully's work really is. While he was on the ropes following these numerous setbacks and not meeting the funding goal on Dirty Bones, if there's one thing Mario Gully does better than almost anyone else, well, it's not give up. Picking himself up and dusting himself off once again. Rather than dwell on not meeting his goal, Gully decided to create a project that would fall inside of the funding parameters that they had managed to meet on the Dirty Bones campaign. Mario Gully simply did not have quit in his vocabulary for so many years. It's crazy. No one makes it through this much crap and still keeps at it. But Gully did. He regrouped and he took a series of commissions and other illustrations that he had done of well-established Marvel and DC and Image, as well as other characters, and put together a Kickstarter for his first sketchbook. The sketchbook seems to have easily reached funding. And then it was like he had just fallen off the side of the earth again, and the posts started. At first, they were, quote, a little behind, and then Gully was, quote, having personal problems, and then they had a post for a GoFundMe for Gully, who was living in a motel with 3 of his 4 kids having been evicted from their home. So the sketchbook was being delayed again and again and again. A few months later, there was a post about how Gully had relocated and was happily living in a hotel now with 3 of his 4 kids, which was operating as his studio for the time being as well. Then they found a publisher for the sketchbook a few months later. Now, mind you, the book had, quote, been going to the printer several months before, so this doesn't really make much sense. But following on the next post, well, Gully's new art manager, who had been helping him run the project, apparently no longer worked for Gully, and Gully announced that he was going to be taking on full responsibilities of getting the book, quote, out to fans personally. Finally, an entire year after the projected shipping date, there was finally an announcement that the book was ready in both hard copy and digital PDF formats and would be shipping in March of 2016. The problem is, it never did. After digging through years of his personal posts on Instagram, Facebook, and liberal usage of the Wayback Machine, here's what I managed to piece together following erased comments, deleted pledge campaigns, and all manner of other tomfoolery. A few years ago, around 2016 or 2017, Mario Gully, by now calling himself OMG or the original Mario Gully, started an art business sometimes called OMG Comics and other times OMG Studios. From what I can tell, it was mostly just fans of his work that wanted to commission work by Gully of established characters and very often of Ant as well. Gully seems to have been doing all right for a while, but as a friend to several highly talented artists, I can tell you that finding a talented artist is one thing. Finding one that can make art and run a business, that's like finding a unicorn that craps diamonds. It just never happens. There were some posts talking about how he'd fallen behind on commissions, and then eventually more and more posts from other people like that until the comments mostly devolved into, hey, you haven't finished my stuff, get back to me, you aren't answering my emails, I've tried getting a hold of you, and then the art studio he was running went on hiatus just prior to the virus shutdown. It seemed as though, except for a small minority of people that were already fans of his prior output, the world had forgotten about Mario Gully. Except for those people that 4 and 5 years later still get on his Facebook page from time to time and yell at him to send them the sketchbooks they paid for, which I can only assume they probably also paid for original sketches in, because those books were up to $200. Over the years, Ant continued to amass a fan base, and in fact, there might be more interest in Ant now than ever before. I think this is in large part due to the internet making it inordinately easier to not only share reviews and suggestions about comics, but also places like Facebook groups and other online communities where like-minded fans can come together and have really helped raise awareness of Gully's work. Over the years, stories about Ant kind of became legend. While the first volume isn't necessarily worth $1 million or anything, for a fairly unknown independent book from the early 2000s, it isn't what I would call cheap, especially if you want to get all of the variants and exclusives. But Ant has continuously been in the periphery of the comic book community discussion for a long time now. Every once in a while, you would hear a whisper about the title or the character, but more often than not, you would read some news article dredging up the decade-old beef between Larsen and Gully. Interestingly, the few times that people did reach out to Gully for comment on the subject, he openly and continually apologized and tried to explain. Gully has said that he was not only difficult to work with, but that Larsen was in the right. He was being paid to do a job, and he hadn't done it. On top of that, he had surrounded himself with a lot of really unhealthy hangers-on, and they were having a seriously negative effect on his life at this point. Gully would continue to say that Larsen was still one of his heroes and praise his work whenever given the chance, as well as espouse his happiness that Larsen was the one who owned Ant now, not anyone else. After all of this research, though, I'll be honest, it's hard to tell if Gully is being sincere, and he really does appreciate the fact that Erik Larsen tried to help bail him out. But with Ant seemingly lost forever and Gully's career in the toilet, it didn't seem to matter that too awful much. Then, a few months ago, those articles bringing up the years-old dispute between the two started showing up at what I can only describe as an alarming rate. It was like these news outlets were trying to remind people of what had happened, but only in the most vestigial of ways. They had basically zero information about Gully, aside from quotes of some of his more raucous comments on social media made during the public dispute with Larsen. They offered no explanation why they were covering this stuff years later. There was no real information in the articles, and certainly no new information. Honestly, I found it super puzzling. No one had talked about Ant in years. Why was she bubbling to the forefront of news coverage and fans' minds once again after all of this time? It got to the point where someone in the comments section on one of my videos where I talked about how much I respect Erik Larsen brought up Mario, Gully, and Ant. I knew then it was time to do a video on this one. I have to have some sort of angle though, some way in, a way to give a video direction. I wasn't just going to talk about this long canceled series and a decade-old fight that played out so publicly that anyone with a modicum of interest can still, to this day, watch a blow-by-blow of the fight play out online. And then it became painfully clear just why the news outlets had been pumping people's brains full of a healthy distaste for a once promising artist who hadn't worked in the industry for years at that point. Ant was coming back. Mario Gully wasn't. It was completely bizarre, and as there really weren't any stories with any interviews or quotes from Larsen about why he would be resurrecting an independent series he'd had in his back pocket for almost 9 years and carried basically nothing but bad baggage along with it, I didn't quite know what to make of it. The original creator was being hammered on in social media and news outlets. Larsen was getting bagged on once again by Gully supporters who felt Larsen had treated him unfairly, and the series had always been under a pretty critical eye because of what some people perceive as rather salacious material. The news felt like it came out of nowhere. No one was asking for Ant to come back, at least not under Erik Larsen, and especially not after so many years. It just felt weird. Then I started doing some digging and reading. People had never really stopped asking Erik Larsen about Ant. Though in many cases, this does seem to have been asked in an effort to provoke some sort of nasty or snarky comment about Gully, which never worked. Larsen is an outspoken and opinionated guy, but he's also a careful and thoughtful individual when it comes to what he says. His negativity is actually very judicious if you look at interviews, especially considering how brutally outspoken and honest he can be. Instead of ragging on Gully or getting dragged into any negativity about the entire affair, he would instead talk about how much he liked the character, and how in fact he had her in his back pocket and was just waiting. Waiting for almost a decade, though? Well, that I can't explain. I mean, he was busy when he bought the series, and considering Gully kept landing in the news, he might have just been waiting for the heat to die down, for people to finally stop talking about it. For one reason or another, though, the Mario Gully Ant incident had continuously found its way into the social consciousness and become a matter of great debate and discussion over the years. Whether he eventually felt like things had calmed down enough or he was just done waiting, Larsen announced that not only was he bringing Ant back under the Image imprint, that he would be writing and drawing it. Rather than starting with the new issue 1, the Image run would kick off with issue 12. Yeah, that issue 12. The issue 12 that Larsen had written and laid out for Gully years before, that was supposed to tie up all those loose ends and somehow have everything make sense, but had instead led to a final confrontation between the two creators that seems to have been the fatal blow to Mario Gully's career and sent him into almost permanent tailspin that resulted in his retirement from the industry, voluntary or not. After months of delays, once again, Ant Volume 2, Issue 12 was released and did indeed tie up all of the loose ends of the past two volumes quite tidily in a neat little package. I don't know how well it did this, and in a lot of ways it felt a lot more like reading just another issue of Ant, except for the ending and the art, which was provided by Erik Larsen himself. Rather than the ambiguous, strange cliffhangers Ant usually left you on, things were neatly wrapped up, with Hannah having her memory return, her powers now under control and actually stronger than ever, as well as reuniting her with her wayward mother. In many ways, it felt like Larsen was kind of going through the motions, and that's not surprising. I don't know about the first print, but I know the second printing of the book that I picked up actually had the layouts that had led to the controversy with Mario Gully in the first place in the back. And they talked about the entire thing. It was surreal seeing those pages now done by Erik Larsen, having seen layouts in some of Gully's roughs for years at this point. The commentary in the back of the book, once again, was not mean-spirited, but I did find it a little strange he would even bring it up at all. With Erik Larsen kind of avoiding the topic in interviews and having never really responded to Mario Gully on social media, I've long wondered how he really felt about the whole thing. If there was a bunch of animosity that we weren't just seeing, or if, as I suspected, Erik Larsen might have understood, while not condoned, Gully's actions, having been surrounded by people who came into money early on in their lives and made all types of insane mistakes. I think the fact that one of the variant covers for issue 12 of Ant was done by Mario Gully kind of answers that question once and for all for me. There may have been hard feelings on one or both ends at some point. Today, though, I think that time has healed whatever wounds there were, and while I wouldn't hold my breath for the two to collaborate on anything anytime soon, I get the feeling that Erik Larsen really doesn't bear Mario Gully any ill will at this point. Still, the fact he brought up Gully at the end of the issue kind of nags at me a little. I know Larsen is in essence rebooting Ant so he can more easily fold her into mainstream Image continuity and deal with some of the nagging aspects of her origin and powers that have bothered him for so long. It just feels weird though. Ant with no Mario Gully? I mean, Larsen is well known for his rather risque tendencies when it comes to rendering the female form himself, but Mario Gully was Ant, and a lot of us had hoped that he always would be. In all of my research for this piece, all of my reading, the interviews, and the articles that I saw, it became clear to me at some point, too, that sadly, Erik Larsen was one of us. He wanted Gully to do Ant. Larsen really did want to see Ant succeed, and I think he did a lot to try and make that happen. Unfortunately, Mario Gully just wasn't at a time and place in his life where he was able to appreciate this, and in the end, it just may have cost him everything when it comes to his comic career. Perhaps we'll see Gully pop back up again though. I mean, it was almost a decade between the 11th and 12th issues of Ant, so why couldn't Gully just suddenly reappear given the newfound attention around his creation, whether he's working on it or not? Anything's possible, and while unfortunately this one definitely doesn't end on what I would call a high note, I hope Gully's story has made that fact abundantly clear. Anything is possible. Yes, in the end, Gully wasn't in a place in his life where he could hold on to or maybe manage what was going on when he achieved success, but he made it. Whatever else you take away from Gully's story, please let it be that. He had a dream and he worked to make it happen. It wasn't always easy, it took a long time, but facing countless adversities and obstacles, Mario Gully still managed to achieve his dream of creating his own comic book and telling his own stories, and I think that's pretty impressive to say the least. As an inmate, he became obsessed with the dream. In jail, Mario Gully found purpose and he followed that dream to a professional career as a comic illustrator. Whatever else might have happened, I found this story extremely inspirational, and I hope you did too. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did like what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about sharing these videos with your friends. Get in the comment section below and let me know. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, updates, info, uncut interviews, and even merchandise discount codes and your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting with YouTube, you can now sign up for memberships right here on YouTube using the join button. So make sure you check out the different tiers for the perks that fit you best. There's also links to my Ko-Fi page where you can make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, a link to my Amazon page where you can donate source material for research and upcoming episodes, and if that's not enough, there's even links to pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you that signed up for my Patreon page, membership here on YouTube, Ko-Fi, donated material, money, and equipment. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. It really means the world to me, and I couldn't do these episodes without your help. Speaking of which, this episode was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as generous grants from the viewers you see on the screen now. I'd also like to thank my loyal Wednesday warriors, Mike Dolan, John Utley, David Arroyo, Super Chasen, and Mike Dolan again, as well as Weapon X Squall, David Arroyo, John Havarton, Thomas Perkins, and Alex Gaylor for their generous donations this month. You guys are amazing, and I don't even know what to say other than thank you so much. And speaking of which, thank you for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. Either way, as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.